My name is J.R. Ryall and I'm the head pastry chef at Ballymaloe House in County Cork in Ireland. My earliest food memory is of Ballymaloe. When I was 4 years old, my Aunt Evelyn, who worked at the cookery school, took me on a tour of the cookery school, the gardens and the grounds that surround it. At the end of the tour that day, I met Myrtle Allen and she signed a copy of her book, Simply Delicious, for me. And inside the cover, she wrote, "For John Robert, who will be a great chef when he grows up. Love from Myrtle Allen, 1992. And that sowed a seed. And from then on, if anybody asked me what I wanted to do in life, I would always say I wanted to be a chef. For the next 10 years after that, I would try and cook any recipe I could get my hands on at home, anything my mother would allow me to. But this meant it was normally cakes and biscuits and pastries. Because, if you're an 8-year-old and you want to make something for your family, they don't generally hand you the leg of lamb. They hand you butter, sugar and eggs. So I would make cakes for family birthdays or for friends. Gradually, I would learn how to make a lighter sponge or a better biscuit or whatever it was. That was the stepping stone that led me into wanting to take cookery really seriously. I still have the book. It's the jewel of my cookery book collection. Of course, I have hundreds of books since, but I still go back to it. I love opening that page and seeing it, and it really reminds me of what first inspired me to want to be in the kitchen. When I was 13, my mother gifted me a course at the Ballymaloe Cookery School, and it was a 2.5-day bread making course. And that was the first time I was introduced to really what the world of cookery was all about. And I came to Ballymaloe, I stayed with my aunt who lived down the road, and over the few days that the course was running, I got to see the entire farm here and everything that was going on. There were so many things I had tasted for the first time in my life, so many things I got to try and make, that I really knew there was something in Ballymaloe for me. So when the course ended, I then asked could I come and do some work experience. Kindly, Dorina said that was okay. It was unusual for somebody so young at the time to want to hang out in kitchens. But they let me come in and I'd help prepare food for the farmer's market. I might be sweating onions or chopping carrots or doing whatever job was helpful for the next person. As the weeks went by, then Dorina thought it would be a nice idea to go and see what the restaurant kitchen at Ballymaloe House was like. So she phoned her brother Rory O'Connell, who was the head chef at the time, and said, I have this young boy, JR, who'd love to see inside a professional kitchen. So Rory said, yes, tell him come over this evening, knock on the kitchen door and ask for me. So I was dropped off at the kitchen door that day, asked for Rory, was brought in, and I had never seen anything like it in my life. Rory showed me the menu. There were ingredients I'd never heard of, dishes I had never imagined. The first job I was given to do was to remove the seeds from a tray of roasted red peppers. Rory showed me how to open the pepper and remove the seeds. And he said, it's very important that you remove every single seed from this pepper, because attention to detail is the difference between something being good and something being great. And it's a very fond first memory of the kitchen in Ballymaloe, but I learned that day that attention to detail in the simplest thing is really what makes something memorable. But unfortunately for me, the shift didn't end the way I planned, and actually I managed to slip and throw a tray of salad leaves that I was carrying across the kitchen, and I landed on my back and everyone turned and looked at me, and I was absolutely mortified, as you would be as a teenager, after upscuttling everything at the end of a busy service, and I couldn't get out of there quick enough. So anyway, the next day, I was back in the cookery school to do more work experience, and Dorina said to me, without drawing breath, I bet you had a wonderful time. I'll send you again tonight. And I didn't have it in me to tell her that actually I really had a terrible ending to the evening and didn't want to ever go back. So she picked up the phone, phoned Rory and said I'd be coming again. So I had to go over the second night. And so I bit my tongue. That was fine. Turned up at the kitchen door. And I was led into a room in Ballymaloe House called Sweets, which is the pastry kitchen, a room of its own, out of sight from all the other chefs, which was perfect for me, given that I'd fallen in front of all of them. Meredith, who was the head pastry chef at the time, welcomed me into Sweets. That evening, I really realised that Ballymaloe had something that I wanted to come back for time and time again. I saw the largest batch of meringues I'd ever imagined being made, saw truffles being dipped in chocolate. We were cutting out thin, heart-shaped shortbread biscuits to serve with fresh fruit fools. This was exactly what I had always dreamt about and really built on what I'd been practicing doing at home. So at the end of that shift, I asked could I return to Ballymaloe House. After doing a summer work experience there, one day I had a call on my phone. It was from Rory O'Connell, and he was offering me my first paid job, which was a Saturday shift in the pastry kitchen once a week. and I was over the moon. Each Saturday, I would take a taxi from the boarding school I went to, which is local to Ballymaloe, to the kitchen, work for the day, and then take a taxi back. And for my last 2 years in school, I gradually wove myself into the pastry team, and that's when I met Mrs. Allen. So my early memories of Ballymaloe were knowing Dorina. And for a kid growing up in the 90s, everybody knew about Dorina because of her TV show. And I didn't know so much about Mrs. Allen. But when I started doing those Saturday shifts in the pastry kitchen, each day I would meet Mrs. Allen. She would come around the house, she'd come through the kitchen, and she'd check in on everyone. I was very lucky with my timing in that when I was starting in Ballymaloe, Mrs. Allen was in her late 70s, and she had been really busy in the years leading up to that, doing so many things in Ballymaloe and outside of it. But at that time, she was handing over many of her duties in other organisations and spending more time in the house again. And that was when I was in the kitchen. So suddenly she was in the kitchen more than she used to be, and I was there. And we got to know each other quite well, and most of the time we spent together was cooking. She would cook with anyone in the kitchen, depending on what was going on, but she took a particular interest again in the pastry kitchen because Meredith, who was the head pastry chef, had left. So Mrs. Allen used to put on her white jacket, she'd come in and she'd peel apples with us, she'd start planning the menus again. Gradually, we worked our way through her cookery book, the Ballymaloe cookery book, which she wrote in the 1970s. And after a year, we had cooked through the recipes in the book once. At the end of the second year, we'd cooked through the recipes in the book twice, and I became really familiar with her repertoire. So it became very easy for us to cook together. And then when I was 18, in 2006, I moved to Dublin to go to university. And anytime Mrs. Allen was in Dublin, she'd get in touch and we'd go for lunch or we'd go for dinner. She'd bring me along as her +1 to the events that she was attending. And I hadn't quite realised at the time how important she was to everybody else in Ireland and even internationally, and how the ripples of what she was doing in Ballymaloe had touched so many shores. But as I was attending the events with her, I could see immediately how much everybody was really grateful for the work she had done. So I suppose the thing that struck me most about Mrs. Allen was how she paid so much attention to the very simple things and how that added up to something being really amazing. She would always look at how fresh things were, and she would never really decide what the menu was going to be until the produce arrived. On a Wednesday, when I would be coming back to work, I would often call into a fruit farm near Rathcormac and I'd load up my car with fruit and drive it back to Ballymaloe. And when I'd unpack the car into the kitchen, we'd look at the strawberries and the raspberries and the blackcurrants and the gooseberries. And then she would decide what we would do with them. Now, of course, there was lots of fruit growing in the garden at Ballymaloe as well. So on top of this, there could have been plums and peaches and cherries or apricots, whatever there was, or things coming from the glasshouses. And only when she really saw what was there would she decide what we were going to cook. And this was something that was totally new to me. So gradually, I could see the formulas and the way she would think and the way she would taste and how she would assign things. And working alongside someone who took that as their approach, that was completely produce focused, had a huge impact on me at the time. And that's how I like to do things now, today. So I'd been working at Ballymaloe for 2 years, and I was coming to the point where I was finishing up at school and I had to try and decide what to do. And even though I knew from the age of 4 I wanted to be working with food, I wasn't 100% confident that if I went immediately into working in a food job that I'd be content for my whole life. So it made sense to think about doing something else. So I decided to study natural science. So I went to Trinity College in Dublin to do a 4-year course. When I was 18, I moved to Dublin and I would spend term time there. And then each summer I travelled back to Ballymaloe and I'd work for 4 months. So I'd join the pastry team for the busy summer season. And then I'd come back at Christmas or during holidays, or any time Mrs. Allen would call me. If there was something on, I'd jump on the bus and I'd be back down to Ballymaloe. I was delighted, really. I had the best of both worlds. I got to be a student in Dublin. I made great friends doing lots of different things. I got to eat in restaurants that I'd never heard of. But then I also was satisfied in that I was coming back to Ballymaloe to get the buzz of the kitchen and still learning from Mrs. Allen every day on how to cook. So it was a really slow and steady gradual apprenticeship. It's not something I ever set out to do. So when I was 21, going into my 4th year in college, my final year, on my last day in Ballymaloe that summer, I was having a cup of tea with Mrs. Allen and she offered me the job to be the head pastry chef in Ballymaloe. And 2 things crossed my mind. One was, did she know I was only 21? Because this sort of seemed like quite a lot to put on the shoulders of a 21-year-old. And then the other thing I wondered was, did she know I was returning to Dublin the next day to finish my course? So I pointed both out to her. She didn't mind my age, and she said that she did know I was going back to Dublin, but she'd hold the position for me. So I went back to finish my studies, having accepted the job to be the head pastry chef in Ballymaloe. And it gave me a really interesting opportunity during the year, because I wasn't really doing my course anymore to try and get a job, or I wasn't trying to line up a PhD. And it allowed me to be a type of student that gave me a lot of freedom, actually. Now, I worked hard, and fortunately I did well, but I knew I was coming back to Ballymaloe, and because I had those other experiences at the time up until then, I knew that coming back to Ballymaloe was exactly what I wanted, and I know working with Mrs. Allen was exactly what I wanted. So that day, I suppose, really changed the course of my life. It was when I really decided to be on this journey, to be a proper chef and to work full time. So I came back after my final exam to start the role of being the head pastry chef in Ballymaloe, and I've done it ever since. When I first came back to Ballymaloe full time in 2010, I gradually eased myself into the role of being the head pastry chef, because I hadn't had that experience in any other kitchen. And in Ballymaloe, even though I was there during the busy summer periods, I always had the infrastructure around me of Mrs. Allen coming in every week planning the menus, and the entire team. So when I first came back, once a week, I would sit down with Mrs. Allen and we would plan out the menus for the week. I gradually understood how she thought about what dishes were appropriate any week of the year, how to really plan out things seasonally, with flavour in mind, using the best of what was available. Over about a year, she gradually passed that responsibility onto me. You know, as time went on, I got better at it. I got to realise what things worked, what things didn't work. There were always teething problems. And of course, there were several of us working in the pastry kitchen over the years. My colleague Anne has worked with me all of this time, and other people have been in and out too. So we all grew and learned together. And then as Mrs. Allen stood back from sharing the role with me, I could then really put my arms around it and take a bit of ownership. But then a couple of years into doing it, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great to be able to travel a little? So I spoke to Hazel Allen, who was the general manager of the hotel at the time, and Mrs. Allen, and we came up with a plan where every year I would be able to take 2 months off for January and February. It was sensible for several reasons. One was because Ballymaloe would close in January to do maintenance on the very old building that houses the hotel and the restaurant. And then February was always the quietest month for business. So it meant that I was away for the quietest time of the year, and then I would be there all summer long. So in 2013, I head off on my first trip. So I booked flights to Southeast Asia and I backpacked around Thailand, Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam. It was wonderful. It was eye-opening, and it was exactly what I wanted at the time. And then the following year, I thought, rather than just backpacking, how about I go and do some stages or internships, and I volunteer in other kitchens, so then I could really see what people are doing. People similar to me, pastry chefs in other countries, and see what produce they're using and what they get up to. The next year, I went to California and I staged a tartine bakery in San Francisco and at Chez Panisse in Berkeley. And Chez Panisse is one of those fantastic restaurants in the world, which has lots of cross-pollination with Ballymaloe, because we're very like-minded in our approach to cooking and produce. And it was eye-opening. And then I realized the benefit of going on these trips and seeing what other people are doing. And then in the meantime, when I would be in Ballymaloe working in Ireland, I'd often jump on a flight to go to London and stage somewhere. So I'd been to the River Cafe, to Petersham Nurseries when Sky Gingo was there, Le Manoir Cat Saison, where Raymond Blanc rules, Paul A. Young, who makes chocolate in Soho, Ottolenghi, and I'd jump in and out of these kitchens. And I'd also get to eat in the restaurants in London or wherever else I was going. Gradually over those years, as I could see what other people were doing who were at the top of their game, I could then understand what made Ballymaloe utterly unique as well, because I had the comparison of these other places. And I then understood how important flavours were to place, and really all of the things Mrs. Allen was telling me all along and teaching me suddenly crystallised in my mind, and I could then understand how important that crisp shortbread biscuit is on welcome with a cup of tea, or how a perfectly made summer fruit fool can be just as memorable as any complex pastry or tart, and that they all have a similar purpose and need depending how they're served. So travelling and seeing what other people were doing made me much more confident in my own role, made me much more comfortable being here in Ireland, off-piste on a farm, doing what I really enjoy. The desserts in Ballymaloe are served off a dessert trolley or a cart, and there's always been a dessert trolley in the dining room at Ballymaloe. The purpose of the trolley is that we can make desserts similar to those that anyone would make at home. Whole tarts and pies, homemade ice creams, mousses, sorbets, meringues, and put these desserts onto the trolley that can go from table to table, and every guest can have all or just one or whatever amount of dessert they would like. And it's a sort of an elegant yet informal way to serve guests daily changing desserts. So every day at Ballymaloe, we plan a menu of 5 desserts that change completely one day to the next. Of course, using the produce that's available to us from the farm and the gardens. When I say the desserts change, it's not to say the produce changes, in that tonight there might be raspberries in a sorbet, tomorrow they might be in a tart, the following night they might be in a mousse. You'll see the produce being used and reinvented in different ways night to night. There's always a pastry element, some sort of tart or cake, always a frozen dessert, whether it's an ice cream, a sorbet, a bomb, or granita. There's always a fruit. It could be a pile of fresh cherries, a fruit compote. There's always something moussey or wobbly or sort of set. So that could be a fruit fool or panna cotta layered with coffee jelly, or a trifle at Christmas time. And then there's always some sort of meringue, because of course we make lots of ice creams and we use egg yolks, so it makes sense to use the whites in a meringue. So the meringues could be flavoured with fresh citrus curds, layered with berries in the summertime. At Christmas it could be a coffee meringue layered with whiskey cream, or walnut meringue with pear and fresh cream. So we cycle through lots of different recipes in each of these categories and try to pick the desserts so they complement one another. So if somebody is to have a little bit of each dessert, that they really go together on the plate. But there is one dessert we make every night that never changes, and that's Carageen moss pudding. The word Carrig in the Irish language means rock, and Carageen means little rock. So Carageen moss is essentially translates to little rock moss, which is very appropriate because the seaweed itself, the Carageen, grows on all the little rocks around our coastline. And during midsummer, we go and collect or forage the seaweed from the rocks, and then we dry it out in the traditional way. And I do this just as Mrs. Allen taught me, where we pick the seaweed, we lay it out on either the cliff tops or on neatly cut grass. The sun dries it, and then the first rainfall after the seaweed is dried will wash it and remove the colour from the seaweed. It then dries again and we collect it and bring it indoors. And then we use it to set milk into a very soft set pudding. And there's tradition of eating this type of dessert in Ireland for centuries. It's been used to fortify milk, to feed babies, to help sick animals, and even sick people. So often if somebody isn't feeling well, we'll say, did you have a little Carageen? Or make a throat syrup with it, something to help nourish. It's so delicious and it's so good for you that actually, we just have it as a daily food. It's a really fun one. And then for visitors who come to Ireland or to Ballymaloe, seaweed desserts aren't the first thing that spring to mind. Normally we would think of Asia or certainly other cultures. You don't think of the Irish as digging into seaweed. So the fact that we have a soft set, bright white pudding set with seaweed intrigues people, and generally the further someone has travelled, the more interested they are to try it. So we always have it on the trolley, and it's a very special thing. So when we're serving the Carageen, there's a couple of ways that we like to serve it. It pairs perfectly with any fruit compote, so whatever it is during the year, whatever's in season. And we always like to have some softly whipped cream and a sprinkle of dark muscovado sugar. And the sugar in this case acts almost like a seasoning. Can you imagine having a potato without butter and salt? You can't. So it's hard for me to imagine eating Carageen without a little softly whipped cream and soft dark brown sugar. For me, it's part of the dish. At the end of 2018, we got a letter to say we had been longlisted in the World Restaurant Awards for a category called Trolley of the Year. And I have to be honest, when I first read the letter, I thought it might be a joke, because the idea of winning an award called Trolley of the Year seemed, well, number one, it seemed like we were a perfect fit for the category, but it also sounded potentially a little bit made up. But anyway, we quickly realised this is a really serious thing, and that there were restaurants all around the world who were longlisted in many different categories for the awards. So we waited, and then we heard we were shortlisted in the final 3 restaurants. There was a restaurant from New York and a restaurant in London, and there was Ballymaloe House. Now, it wasn't a dessert trolley category. The restaurant in London used trolleys for serving all sorts of things, sweet and savoury. And then the trolley that was nominated in New York on the shortlist did a lot of tableside carving. And then our trolley, of course, was the desserts. So we really weren't sure how it was going to go. The awards finals happened in Paris in February 2019. So Myrtle Allen and I went along to the awards that night. I was actually on one of my 2-month trips in Mexico. So I flew back from Mexico to be in Paris for the 2 days, which was great fun and added to the excitement for me. Anyway, lo and behold, on the night, Ballymaloe House was the winner of the category. So we had a great time in Paris and it was really fun for us. It was great for my team, Ballymaloe, Fran and I, and for the other pastry chefs, because it was really nice to be recognized that way. And then after the awards, suddenly we got a little bit of extra attention on the desserts we were making and how we served them. And lots of people said, oh, what's next? Will there be a book? 7 years before this, Myrtle Allen liked the idea of me writing a little book that we could sell on the hall table. But at the time, I didn't have quite the confidence to go about it. So after the award in Paris, and after a bit of encouragement from some friends, I thought, you know what, maybe now is the time to look into doing the book. We got the ball rolling, started the conversation. The following spring, I was in New York doing a pop-up, which I nicknamed Off My Trolley, where I did a pop-up dessert trolley in a friend's restaurant in the West Village. The restaurant's called King. It's run by 2 former past students, Claire DeBoer and Jess Shadbolt. I sent them an email and said, how would you like the idea of a dessert trolley popping up in your restaurant for a service, just for fun? So they said they loved the idea. So I shipped glassware from Ireland, brought linen from my friend's linen company, got my friends in Kerry from Ryall Pottery to make plates, shipped all of these things out. We sourced a beautiful old antique trolley, put it in the middle of the dining room, and I recreated a very similar style of trolley to what I do at Ballymaloe House. And we had about 100 people come for Sunday lunch, and they all had dessert from the trolley. So it was great fun. And for me, it was really nice, rather than just going on a stage, but actually to bring a little bit of what I do day to day to somewhere new and to get to work with friends in another country. So it was very exciting. And when I was in New York that week, Claire at the restaurant said, oh, well, if you're thinking about writing a book, you've got to meet an agent. So she set up a meeting with an agent she was talking to at the time for me, Carrie. So I went and chatted to Carrie for an hour in her office up near Midtown in Manhattan, and it felt like I was in a movie. It was very exciting. So suddenly the little book on the hall table was starting to grow into something a lot bigger than that. And then Carrie helped me craft the book proposal. And later that year, I got a book deal with Phaidon through their New York offices. So for the last 2 years, I've now been working on my debut book, Ballymaloe Desserts, and that is a subtitle of Iconic Recipes and Stories from Ireland, in which I try to capture how I was dazzled by Ballymaloe and Mrs. Allen, how I feel about the place, and how I feel about the food and the dishes and the flavours that we cook, and how we serve dessert, the culture that surrounds how we celebrate eating at Ballymaloe. And I try to fit all of that into the book. So it's been a bit of a journey, but it's not such a small book anymore. It's a proper grown-up adult book. So my day-to-day at Ballymaloe always happens at the restaurant in Ballymaloe House, but there's so much more to Ballymaloe than just the restaurant and the hotel. Around Ballymaloe House is the Ballymaloe Farm, which is the grain store, which is an amazing multi-purpose venue. There's a shop and a cafe, a 2-acre orchard. There's a centuries-old wall garden adjacent to the house, Bluebell Woods, and lots of lovely gardens and walks to experience for the guests who stay with us. And a couple of kilometres down the road, we have the Ballymaloe Cookery School on its own farm, a 100-acre organic farm, and is the only cookery school in the world to be situated in such a way. And on that farm, there's another shop, there's a 1-acre glasshouse, market gardens, pleasure gardens, bread shed, a small dairy that supplies us with all of the dairy products we use in the kitchen. Much of what's grown there in the glasshouses, in the gardens, feed into Ballymaloe House's restaurant kitchen, and it's also the produce that the students at the cookery school get to cook with every day. And an add-on to the course is that students from the school can come over to Ballymaloe House in the evenings. They can experience what it's like to be in a busy professional kitchen, much like I did years ago, and they get a taste of all of the aspects of what go on in Ballymaloe. The one thing I would always try to advise people starting out is to find a good mentor. And I'm really lucky. I had some incredible mentors and still have them to this day. From Rory O'Connell, Mrs. Allen, Dorina, Rachel, Hazel. And when you have a mentor that you really connect with, somebody whose advice you want to hear and you want to receive, and you want to work on the feedback you're getting, it really changes how you work day to day and how you think about the things you're doing. So find a good mentor, somebody who you really look up to, and try and spend as much time as you can with them. And that will really help you in every way. You know, you'll flourish professionally, but you'll get so much satisfaction from your job that suddenly your work life becomes your social life and everything will change. And you can have a really, really great time working in food.